so let's talk through some Codex rules for the glory of Russ and the Allfather, with an overview of Codex Space Wolves in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Wolves, and in this video let's take a look at the full match play rules for the Sons of Fenris, going through their new army rules, datasheets and detachments, and a few big changes that take this codex a bit away from the norm from Divergent chapters. The book's first coming out in the Space Wolves big army set box set, and then the individual release with all their new kits being sold individually will follow somewhere like 4 to 8 weeks after. I feel like there'll be really quite a lot more people jumping in to collect an army of the Space Wolves. As it goes, their Primaris update with their range of new models has been pretty well done, lots of really nice sculpts that people have enjoyed. For this one though, let's talk through the contents of Codex Space Wolves, and this one's technically a Codex supplement book, so it's designed to be used as an add-on to core Codex Space Marines, so you can use any of the units in that one aside from things from specific chapters, plus any of the core Codex detachments as well. For the contents of the book, there's lore and miniature galleries as per normal, updates on how Space Wolves make war, and lots of nice new pictures of all the new models. There's Crusade content to forge some sagas for your characters, and the new combat patrol rules, the updated one with the Wolfguard battle leader, Wulfen, Terminators, and Bloodclaws. In general, that's been pretty well received. For this video, I'm going to talk about the core rules section for the Space Wolves. There are some faction rules for the army, making reference to using Oath of Moment for the Space Marines, a central rule for sagas which are relevant for the detachments, and Curse of the Wulfen which is relevant for their datasheets and their dreadnoughts, plus some sort of army organisation things saying which units you can and can't take. Then there's 3 detachments in this book, all with a detachment rule for enhancements and 4 stratagems, and they each use that saga mechanic where you basically have 1 detachment rule and it gets boosted if you achieve a quest. And then for the rest of the codex there's 20 unique Space Wolves datasheets, really quite a big cut down compared with the ones that they had previously. Some notable casualties such as the Stormwolf and Stormfang flyers, but also updated rules for all of their rather shiny and pretty cool looking new kits. There are some points costs in the codex, though in general they tend to be out of date. I'll talk through the points costs that are here currently, but they'll likely change in a big way when Games Workshop publishes the digital points for the Wolves. I guess we'll either get that via a download or through Games Workshop's content creators sharing them, and I'll certainly cover them here on the channel when we get news. As ever, if you were looking to pick up the Codex or the Space Wolves army set when it goes live, check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. They can save money around the world, usually between 10 or 20% off Games Workshop's prices, and if you use any of the links in the video description, they help to support Auspex Tactics. If you're watching this early, these are the pre-order times for the Space Wolves army set, which is going live this weekend. I'll probably try and be at least somewhat early if you want to guarantee them at discount. Fingers crossed Games Workshop's made enough of them though. In any case, a big thank you to anyone using those links to support the channel. Let's get into it though, and let's talk through the core rules things and then move on to the detachments and then all the datasheets. First up, as mentioned, Space Wolves still use the army rule Oath of Moment from core Codex Space Marines. This one just makes allusions to use that rule from the main book, and it gives you the standard Space Marine big rerolls against 1 marked targets chosen in your command phase. So basically pick 1 unit and that one's going to be extra easy to kill. It's usually most effective on things that can hit on a 3+, as that means that you essentially get a plus 33% damage output boost, all other things being equal. And that's quite a big deal on a big scary melee threat or something like that, or focused fire from multiple different shooting units. It means that Space Wolves tend to be pretty good at wrecking any one big thing in the enemy army, and this helps them with that quite a lot. Occasionally it can make sense to reroll everything that isn't a 6 for certain attacks with special rules, things that hit on a 2+ and say get sustained and lethal hits, or sustained hits too. It might make sense to just literally reroll everything. There's some combos in the book where you might be able to stack both lethal hits and sustained hits with certain combinations of characters and detachment rules. In any case, nothing particularly unexpected there. Otherwise, there's perhaps more core rules things than I might have expected for a Space Marine supplement book, most of them at least fairly minor, though still important to how the army functions. First up, they mentioned the sagas mechanic, which is common to their 3 detachments. I'm not really sure they necessarily needed a core rule for this, but basically just underlines the idea is that you've got a detachment rule where you've got a weaker version of it and a stronger version of it, and if you do your saga quest, which is spelled out in the detachment, then you unlock the stronger version. I guess it doesn't hurt to underline that, though maybe feels a tiny bit redundant, given it's more or less spelled out on each detachment. Otherwise, it was interesting to take a look at the Space Wolves unit restriction list. The ones in this codex just have the more sort of generic chapter rules, basically saying that if you're making things with a Space Wolves keyword, you can't be using things with other chapter keywords, things like Rabute Gilliman of the Ultramarines, Dante of the Blood Angels, or Deathwing Knights of the Dark Angels. So basically, if you're taking Space Wolf units, then you're not mixing chapters. Seems they haven't decided to put the restriction on apothecaries or tactical squads, which Space Wolves have generally not been able to field, at least not here. The rules at the moment are held in the errata document for Codex Space Marines, which I guess will need an update, in particular because the previous rules lock you out of taking Devastators, and that doesn't make sense anymore given that the Longfang datasheet has been removed from this book. I guess that means that when the digital updates with the points and things for the Space Wolves go live, that document will get changed as well, and at the very least they should be able to field Devastators. I'd guess they'll probably still get locked out of taking Apothecaries and Tactical Squads though, given that they don't use them in the lore. While we're on just general themes and their interactions with Codex Space Marines, I think it is worth mentioning at the start that this Codex does seem to work really quite differently to Blood Angels and Dark Angels with its interaction with core Codex Space Marines. Unlike the Blood Angels and Dark Angels detachments and datasheets, a lot of the supporting rules are locked to Space Wolf unique units, both with things like enhancements and stratagems and certain datasheet abilities that can buff things. Most of the time for those books, they're generally targeting any Adeptus Astartes unit from your army. So say if you have Blood Angels Blade Guard or Dark Angels Hellblasters, they can still use basically the full effects of the army, but it's not really going to be the case for this book. It means that a lot of those generic units just aren't going to be able to use certain stratagems and options, and there's another couple of big changes on top of that. The detachments don't get Armour of Contempt at base, which is a bit of a blow, as that's really quite a useful defensive stratagem. And another really big one is that Space Wolf squads can't be led by generic characters, so you can't say have Bloodclaws being led by a captain to represent a Wolf Lord or a librarian to represent a Rune Priest, and the Space Wolf unique characters in the book can't lead other generic units, so you can't have Ragnar Blackmane leading Assault Intercessors or Blade Guard anymore. For better or worse, it's going to mean that the Space Wolf Codex is a lot more self-contained. There's going to be far greater emphasis placed on their unique units versus the other divergent chapters, which I'd certainly say isn't the worst thing in the world, but it also may be kind of weird to make generic Primaris feel like second-class Space Wolves, even if they're equally Sons of Russ. Say if you take a Devastator squad to represent Longfangs, a whole bunch of Codex rules and synergies just won't work on them. Some of the detachments look like they'd be a bit irritating to remember which rules are locked to Space Wolves units and which ones can be used for generic Space Marines, as most of the detachments look like they're split kind of 50-50 on what things are allowed on what. That looks like a very easy source for making mistakes, and I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of the character support choices being locked out, as that also feels unusual. Just feels a bit arbitrary to say that Ragnar can't lead Blade Guard if they happen to be in your army, or you can't have a captain act as a Wolf Lord and lead your Headtakers into battle. I guess it might leave some design room to make those units stronger and more efficient though, if you only have to think about the specific characters and leader choices that can lead them, as opposed to having to think about every single unit in Codex Space Marines and whether or not that's going to break something in some way. I think I probably would have liked to see something with a bit more freedom personally though. Finally, for core Codex rules, we've got the Curse of the Wulfen. This one's written as a generic rule, but only really applies to 4 datasheets. The 2 different standard Wulfen squad datasheets, and the Wulfen Dreadnought and Murderfang, all of which normally were OC0, and that's what they were in the previous index. It basically means that if they're near a character, they can gain some OC. If a unit's within 6 inches of a non-Wulfen character, or 12 inches of a Wolf Priest, then you add 1 to the OC of infantry models, and you add 3 to the OC of vehicle models. The buff only applies if the Wulfen aren't battle-shocked, so you can't use it to defeat the OC0 of that. Overall, that is quite a good improvement to them, particularly for the standard Wulfen squads. They've generally been pretty efficient damage and defensive units. If they can have a way to get some objective control and exert some presence and make themselves into more of a trading unit by some characters nearby, that could be a really big win. That certainly seems helpful for the Wolf Priest in particular. Both the regular Wolf Priest and Ulrich the Slayer can trigger that. Let's get into it though, and let's talk through the 3 detachments of the book. These ones are all called Sagas: Saga of the Bold, Saga of the Beastslayer, and Saga of the Hunter. Saga of the Bold is the sort of index successor character-focused one, which maybe has a couple of similarities to the Champions of Russ, but for the most part is pretty well a new detachment. Then Saga of the Beastslayer is the one for bringing down the biggest and scariest monsters and war machines for the glory of Russ. It does have some pretty great stratagems as well, and I do kind of wonder whether that one might well wind up being the strongest one. Then we've got Saga of the Hunter, Space Wolves working together as a pack to bring down foes, with some bonuses for multiple units fighting side by side, and a few things that specifically help out their actual wolf units like the Hunting Wolves and Fenrisian Wolves. On top of this, they can also use the Champions of Fenris Grotmus detachment, which would be another option for how to field them, though generally wasn't rated as very good and hasn't been used very much since it came out. They're also able to use all the core Codex Space Marine detachments as well. In particular, Stormlance has been really quite popular for Thunderwolves, and Gladius does okay for sort of mixed threat with a bit of melee. Both of those can allow some big army-wide advance and charge when needed, and that's usually quite a big deal for Space Wolves, particularly with their extra movement now. They can have some very big threat ranges indeed. Aside from the units that Space Wolves can't take anyway, those detachments don't lock out any units, and for the most part the detachments are at least fairly general purpose this time around. Just a few stratagems that might favour certain units, say some stratagems locked to say Wulfen or Bloodclaws, or to the Beast units, that maybe might push you a little bit in one way or another for each detachment, but I'm glad to see that they're mainly quite general purpose, which I think is a real strength. Let's get into detachment things though, and first up we have the Saga of the Bold. As mentioned, this is the already character themed detachment as a successor to the Index one, and if you're playing this you're likely to have a massive amount of heroes in your army, lots of squads with leaders, taking names and destroying things for Russ and the Allfather. The core rule for this one is called Heroes All, and it means that character units can reroll a hit, wound or damage roll whenever they're shooting or fighting. So just a small but impactful army-wide damage buff there. You could be using that for some big scary character attacks with damage 3 perhaps. But then the rule gets to a seriously powerful reroll, one hit roll, wound roll and damage roll for every unit on the board if you can achieve your Saga. As core rules go, I'd say it's alright at base, particularly if you're spamming characters, which you almost certainly will be here. Maybe not a massive impact though, but when you jump up to those full rerolls, that's a massively powerful detachment rule. Maybe having the single biggest effect on big shooting units, maybe with a bunch of las cannons, though it will help out everything. The Saga rules for unlocking the boosted rule are a bit more complex than the other two detachments. The idea is that your army has 4 mini-quests that they can try and achieve, called boasts. Character units have to try and achieve these boasts, and when 3 out of the 4 ones have been achieved somewhere in your army sometime in the game, then you unlock the bigger rule. The first one's a nice and easy destroy an Oath of Moment target with a character unit, and that feels like that should happen just relatively naturally as they go about doing what they want to do. A bit harder though is having the same units destroy 2 Oath of Moment targets in succession over the course of the game. Not impossible if it's a big scary unit and the opponent fails to do anything about it, but it just might not be necessarily very convenient or force you to use Oath of Moment in a weird way on a suboptimal target to make it happen, and the opponent might just destroy the unit that you just used to take down their Oath target. Say maybe you have some Wolfguard Headtakers jump on a unit and destroy it, and then the enemy just destroys it in turn. Definitely not impossible for this one, but in many games seems quite hard to guarantee. Next up there's another slightly unreliable one, with a character unit being wholly within the enemy deployment zone at the end of either player's turn. In theory that could be possible if you have Logan Grimnar or Arjak Rockfist deep strike into the enemy deployment zone, but that's only going to be doable if your opponent's actually left room for them, and a lot of the time it's really quite possible to screen out the entire deployment zone, which I guess they'll be trying to do if you have this. Otherwise you're going to have a unit that's going to need to slog its way all the way forward, and there's likely to be a lot of the enemy army in the way. Finally there's one called Hold the Line, which should be easier, scoring an objective in the midfield from Battle Round 2 onwards. Ideally take a character and a whole bunch of Grey Hunters or Bloodclaws and swarm a mid-board objective, and that one should be fairly doable. One thing to bear in mind with this one is that it keys off Space Wolf characters, not just Adeptus Astartes characters in general, so it has to be the characters from this book. That means that you can't just use, say, something like a Phobos Lieutenant to deep strike in the backfield to claim your overrun their position boast, which otherwise would be quite a tempting option. I think between the things summed up, it's going to be kind of unreliable to get this one going before turn 3, and potentially not even then if the opponent's still screening out their deployment zone well, and they've managed to stop a unit killing multiple Oath targets in a row. It really could be a big swing in the game though if you manage to somehow do this early. Otherwise, let's move on to stratagems for the detachment. As mentioned, it's worth noting that the Space Wolves don't get Armour of Contempt here, breaking tradition from every single Space Marine detachment in 10th edition that's had that so far. Basically all the stratagems key off character units, though as mentioned some of them key off Space Marine character units, so Adeptus Astartes ones, and some of them must be Space Wolves. First up for one command point there's Inspiring Presence, which is a Space Marine character one, and they gain lethal hits in the fight phase. That's really quite a nice boost against tough stuff and very easy to use. Logan Grimnar and a Terminator unit would enjoy that against most tough stuff. Could be nice with Wolfguard battle leaders with their sustained hits as well. Combined with Oath of Moment you could fish for some 6s there perhaps. For one command point, there's Champion's Guidance. This one's a Space Wolves character, and their unit can reroll hits, and you can use that when shooting or fighting. I guess most of the Space Wolves units don't really have particularly meaningful shooting. I guess you could get a big volley off from Grey Hunters, though it seems like that's going to be far more likely to be used in the fight phase than the shooting phase. Again, that's a solid damage output boost, though pretty direct competition with Oath of Moment. It does mean that you could have 2 units rerolling all hit rolls though for some big damage. For one command point, there's Birth of a Saga. In the command phase, you can nominate one Wolfguard Headtaker model or a Terminator Pack Leader model, and they gain the character keyword until your next command phase, which I suppose could allow a leaderless unit to rack up some boasts or use other boosted stratagems. In reality though, this one just seems like a bit of a miss to me. If you're taking those units, then I really don't see why you wouldn't take leaders already for them in this detachment. Maybe could have some very niche use if the character leading them got sniped out with precision or something. Next up, for one command point, we've got Alpha Strike. For this one, you target a Space Marine character unit, and that unit can advance and charge. Always helpful to have that one as an option. A very direct increase to threat range. Everything from Wolfguard Headtakers, Terminators, Bloodclaws, and Grey Hunters would all like that, with a suitable character attached. And it could be an interesting one for Njal Stormcaller as well, given that he gives you a 6-inch advance. You could have his unit move 13 inches automatically, then shoot, and then charge. Then to round up, there's two big 2 command point ones. Heroic Resolve is a -1 damage 1 for a Space Wolves character unit in the enemy shooting phase. That's a pricey one, but against damage 2 or damage 3 attacks, then that could be well worth it, particularly if you go from an attack that's killing a model per attack to needing 2 attacks to kill a model. It could be very meaningful against certain bits of firepower. And then finally, for 2 command points, there's one called Countercharge. This one is a Space Marine character unit 1. And it basically means that you can charge something out of sequence. In the enemy charge phase, after the opponent has done any charges that they want to do, you can nominate one character unit that can charge an enemy unit within 6 inches. You roll the dice as per normal, and then similar to Heroic Intervention, you don't get your charge bonus this turn, though due to the normal order of selecting combats, you should often have the first opportunity to select the unit before the enemy one if they haven't charged anything. The difference between this one and Heroic Intervention is that for a Heroic Intervention you have to countercharge an enemy unit that has charged. For this one you can just jump on something that's just next to you. So it basically means that the opponent would have to keep 6 inches back from your units if they can't face to meet them in melee. A big pricey one, though that could definitely be pretty impactful. That could threaten to be a bit of a gotcha moment if the opponent doesn't know that you've got it or forgets about it in the game. Overall, some pretty solid stratagems there. Most of them are useful. Advance and charge is always nice to have in a melee focused army. Both the damage buff ones with lethal hits and big rerolls are really useful, and the 2 command point ones are both pretty big situationally. Then for enhancements for the detachment, first up we've got Skjold. This one's printed at 15 points, though printed costs might change of course. You can give this to any Space Marine character, but you gain 1 command point, and provided the bearer is on the board, you can gain 1 command point if a Space Wolves character unit achieves a boast when this model's on the battlefield. It looks like from the way it's written that any time a boast is achieved, even if you've already done it, you can gain a command point, so there could be a pretty reasonable chance to gain 1 command point per battle round there. As usual, you'd be capped at 1 from all sources. I guess this one's pretty redundant if you have Bjorn the Fell-Handed in your army, but if not, certainly seems interesting. Next up, and printed at 20 points, there's Braggart Steel. This one's a Space Wolves character one, so +2 strength to their melee weapons, and if the bearer's unit have achieved a boast, you also get +1 damage. That's really dependent on the character unit having achieved a boast there, as otherwise +2 strength just isn't really worth the 20 points. If you could have the plan to have, say, a battle leader move into the midboard and take an objective on round 2, you could then suddenly power him up to have a strength 10 and damage 3 Thunderhammer though, which is pretty nasty. That feels like it to be worth it, but you really would have to go with the plan of him taking that central objective to reliably get the boast off. Next up, for 15 points, we've got Horde Slayer. Again, this one's a Space Wolf model only, and if there's more enemy models than friendly models within 6 inches at the start of the fight phase, then they gain +2 attacks. If the bearer's unit has achieved a boast at some point in the battle, then they gain +3 instead. This one's a bit situational, but doesn't really hurt. Unless you are against actual Horde units though, then it often just won't trigger if the bearer's leading a unit. Maybe could be okay as a points filler if you don't really have anything else that's worth it. And then finally there's Thunderwolf's Fortitude for 30 points printed. This one can go on any Space Marine model, and the first time that the bearer is slain on a 2+, you can set them back up at the end of phase out of engagement range, and the model comes back with 3 wounds remaining. I feel like these ones are often interesting, and maybe could encourage a character to just operate completely independently, though if it is a really big 30 points cost, and that's quite a big tax. I guess if you wanted a super annoying near unkillable combi weapon lieutenant for disruption things, then this could be one way to do so. They're certainly annoying enough to kill already, never mind the fact that they then get up when they die once again. Overall, definitely has some good value to this one. Nice rerolls on every character unit doesn't hurt, and then the potential for a very big damage boost if they achieve those sagas. There's some nice easy damage buff stratagems plus advance and charge. I'd say the Skjold one is a pretty nice enhancement to have, and that feels borderline auto-include, provided you don't have Bjorn the Fell-Handed rustling up command points anyway. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Ikarus Pattern and Godforge. They're makers of some 3D printed upgrade bits to add a bit more theme to certain big vehicle kits, having things that work with a fair few miniatures to realise a bit more chapter or legion theme, and a few other interesting things. They've got a sale on at the moment with a 10% discount code, as you can see here. The main thing they wanted to share was their new creation, with an option to de-hover some hover tanks, basically an upgrade sprue that can work with some existing plastic models, convert to a rather more traditional tracked base, and maybe add a little bit of chapter theme while doing so. As you can see, there's some nice wolfy bits on this one, and make a rather unique looking centerpiece kit. They've got a fair few options and variations on the same thing, including this one, with a big gun on the top and a rather cool horned beastie skull on the front of the thing. There's a more standard generic version available as well, and also one on the way for smaller hover tanks too. I probably recommend giving their stuff a look though. They've got a bunch of fun creations such as this rather aptly named Loud Raider. Plenty of other really cool creations for various legions as well. And if you want to check them out, there'll be links down in the video description below. They've got their US web store website and also Etsy. There's that Auspex Wolves code on the screen for a 10% discount until the 21st of June, and when you order, the bits are printed on demand and then shipped out once they're ready. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Moving on though, let's take a look at the second detachment, and this one's the Saga of the Beastslayer. The theming of this one is around hunting down great beasts, monsters and war machines, which the Sons of Russ have plenty of practice against, having to deal with the various savage megafauna on Fenris. The core rule for this one is Legendary Slayers, and as detachment rules go, this one's a pretty powerful one. Lethal hits for all units against character, monster or vehicle datasheets, both range and melee. And then if their saga's completed, then you just get flat out lethal hits against literally everything. So a small chance to just completely bypass wound rolls, and will basically be a nice flat damage buff for the rest of the game. To activate that second bit, the rule is that if you destroy half or more of your opponent's vehicle, monster or character datasheets, then the saga is achieved, though it only actually counts as a kill towards your tally if it's done after an attack made by an Adeptus Astartes unit. So things like the enemy dying to hazardous tests or explosion results, that's not going to count towards your kill tally. As detachment rules go, I feel like that's a seriously good and easy to use detachment rule. Obviously it's going to be a lot more meaningful against certain foes than others, but it does mean that just with army construction this could really affect the way that you might want to build units. You might just need fewer dedicated anti-tank units in there, and it means that you could very easily just load up on a bunch of the Strength 5, AP2 and Damage 2 Space Wolf elites between things like Thunderwolves, Headtakers, Wulfen or Wolfguard Terminators. They've got loads of those and they'll all really enjoy lethal hits to do a fair bit more damage to tough stuff. Those style units should already be able to handle most infantry targets just with their base profiles, so maybe a damage buff just wouldn't matter quite as much against those, and dealing with the toughest things around is what they need. It's definitely an interesting one. For activating the second bit, in general things are going to have to be going fairly well your way already, though hopefully there should be a good chance that you achieve that by the end of the game unless you're getting wiped out. The opponent will always have at least one of those units, given that they have to include a character unit to be their warlord, and it could be particularly interesting against really low count enemies where just killing one or two vehicles or characters could potentially trigger the army-wide thing if most of their stuff is infantry. It could give the opponent some counterplay though by trying to keep those important units safe. For stratagems for the detachment, it's got some really quite good ones. First up, there's Thunderous Pursuit. This one's a very nice reactive move one, which generally tend to be powerful. You get to reactive move d6 inches when an enemy ends a move within 9 inches in their movement phase, and that can be used on anything between vehicles, dreadnoughts, or generic Space Marine units, though if your unit is either a Space Wolf infantry unit or a Thunderwolf Cavalry unit, then you can reactive move 6 inches instead. Getting that automatically on a big 6 inches is a really big deal, means that you could potentially have Wolfguard Headtakers or Terminators hide behind terrain when the enemy steps up to destroy them, or backpedal away from charges so they can't get charged this turn, or have some Grey Hunters or something, or move up even further onto an objective to score more points. That's a very strong start on the stratagems. For one command point, there's Impetuosity. This one's either Wulfen or Bloodclaws, and they get to make a surge move of d6 inches after the enemy has shot and destroyed a model in their shooting phase. Weirdly, have to declare this after the enemy has selected targets for the squad, as opposed to actually knowing whether they've killed anything yet, which could occasionally mean that you might use this and then they get unlucky and don't kill anything, and you've just wasted a stratagem for some reason. Feel like they probably should have let you trigger it after you've lost a model. But this one works as surge moves do for other codexes that get them, moving d6 inches as close as possible to the nearest non-aircraft unit, and you can go in engagement range if you want to. Definitely a nice draw to including units of either of those two in this detachment. Occasionally could mean that you just engage something that the opponent really doesn't want you to, and mean that they'd have to keep back from those units if they want to shoot them with multiple things. It also means that those units could potentially hide effectively in close combat if they do manage to tag something, and then the opponent's no longer able to select them as a shooting attack. For one command point, there's Coordinated Strike. This is a return to reserves one for a Space Wolves unit wholly within 9 inches of a battlefield edge, and like many of these, it's triggered at the end of the enemy fight phase. This is just Space Wolf units, so not more generic Space Marine ones, but still that's really quite nice to have. Late game positioning could be a big deal for attacking some of the last units or scoring some points. Definitely a nice one to have access to, even if it is a tiny bit limited on positioning. Next up, for one command point, we've got Unbridled Ferocity, which is a +1 to wound in the fight phase for a Space Wolves unit. That one feels like when combined with the lethal hits is just going to make for a fantastically hitty unit. all of those Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 profiles on Thunderwolves, Wulfen, Wolfguard and their Terminators will all enjoy that. Between lethal hits and a +1 to wound, you should have a very good chance to take down big stuff as well, and this one will work on infantry targets. For one command point, there's Shock Cavalry. This one's a Thunderwolf Cavalry specific one, and it allows them to move through non-titanic models and terrain features that are less than 4 inches in height this phase. You can use it in the movement phase or when they're charging. Could be handy enough to get past screening units, and if the terrain pieces on the board actually are less than 4 inches, that could be a very big deal there. They wouldn't be screened out by ruins anywhere near as much, and you could stage them really easily. I'd say that's probably the biggest deal of this one, but it does really depend on what sort of terrain you're playing with. It is worded as sections of terrain features that are less than 4 inches in height, so I guess if one part of a ruin is less than that, then they could move through. Finally, for one command point, there's Pinning Fire. You trigger this with a Space Marine unit when they shoot a character unit, a monster unit, or a vehicle unit, and it causes them to be pinned until your next shooting phase. While they're pinned, they're -2 to moves and -2 to charge, and the best use of this one would usually be to keep a powerful melee threat out of the fight for a turn or so. Maybe a big fighty melee monster, or a big tooled up character Death Star with Terminators. That means that they're going to have 4-inch less threat range on a charge, and that could easily be the difference between them making it into melee with one of your units or falling short. Overall, that is a very, very strong stratagem section. Reactive moves are great, return to reserves are useful, surge moves are very nice. The +1 to wound thing just seems like really easy value every time that you can use it. The Shock Cavalry one definitely helps out Thunderwolves depending on the board, and that Pinning Fire one could be seriously annoying depending on the units that the opponent has. Overall, just between these and the detachment rule, this seems like a pretty great detachment, an easy big damage buff from the detachment rule, and then some pretty godly supporting stratagems. Finally, we've got the Beastslayer enhancements. First up, there's Wolf Touched, which is printed at 15 points. This one's a Space Wolf model, and they gain +2 movement, and can be attached to both types of Wulfen squads. I think for 15 points that seems like a pretty great deal to me. Those squads hit pretty hard, and you can give them some nice meaningful damage buffs. They really like the +1 to wound all the time from the Wolf Priest, and with him joining them, there'd always be OC1, which is a nice bonus. For the Wolfguard Battle Leader, they'd get Sustained Hits 1, which would be nice for the Hammer variant, and re-rolling hit rolls of 1-2 if they're in melee as well. That's a nice damage boost, particularly with what the detachment can offer them, and also that squad would still have OC1 just for the character model themselves, so they will be able to do things like actions, which is rather nice. This one seems really good. I think it would be tempting to have one of those leading a Wulfen squad with that 15-point one if it costs that much. For 20 points, there's Hunter's Guile. This one's any Space Marine model, and after armies are deployed, you can redeploy 3 Thunderwolf, Wulfen, or Bloodclaw units, and then put them in reserve if you want to. Doesn't seem unhelpful maybe if you have some sort of Death Star style units of those. You might be able to wrongfoot the enemy, or make sure they're better hidden than they otherwise would have been depending on how the opponent's deployed. Feels like it could be alright as a points filler, though not crazy standout for 20 points. Next up and printed at 20 points, there's Elder's Guidance. This one's for a Space Wolves model. Once per game in the fight phase, if you're leading Bloodclaws, then you can add +1 to the AP of the melee weapons of that squad, which with this detachment seems like a pretty good one. They'll enjoy that just whatever they're facing against, given it's going from AP1 to AP2, which is a very meaningful jump. But with lethal hits on the go as well, it should mean that they've got a good chance to really chew through some high armor. Plus they'd have additional buffs from the character, either rerolls and sustained hits from the battle leader, or the +1 to wound from the Wolf Priest. At 20 points that seems pretty reasonable if you've got a big squad of them, even if it's just the once per game. Then finally, for 15 points, there's the Helm of the Beastslayer. This one's for any Space Marine model, and attacks made by character monster or vehicle models, or reduce their AP by 1 when targeting the bearer's unit. So it's basically like an always-on Armour of Contempt, but only against those unit classes, and it is models, so it wouldn't apply to other models in the character squad, just the character themselves. Still though, that really doesn't seem too bad for 15 points. Maybe it could be particularly nice if you've got a big unit of Bloodclaws wanting to fight for the mid-board, and just be a big tanky annoying unit. Would seem fairly reasonable to throw that in, though I guess you'd be weighing it up against the extra AP one for a bit more damage. Still seems usable, but against a lot of foes it just won't have too much effect. Overall, between all that, this one does seem like a pretty solid detachment. Help against tough stuff, and potentially big lethal hits against everything if you can get those kills. Really good stratagem support, and a few usable or interesting enhancements, particularly given the context of the Space Wolf Elite unit. This does seem to give them what they need. Finally, we've got the Saga of the Hunter, and the idea behind this one is the theming of Space Wolves working as a great wolf pack, working in tandem with their battle brothers and their actual wolf allies to bring down their prey, ripping and tearing them apart in close combat usually. The core rule for this one is called Pax Quarry, and if you make a melee attack with a Space Wolves keyword unit that targets an enemy in engagement range of another friendly unit, then he gets to add 1 to the hit roll, so you're usually going to be hitting on a 2+ there. and then if you happen to have completed your Saga already, you get to add 1 to the wound roll as well. The Saga of the Hunter is a fairly nice straightforward kill tally type thing for enemies destroyed in the fight phase. You've achieved your Saga after 2 enemy units have been destroyed in the fight phase and incursion games, 3 have been destroyed in Strike Force games, and 4 for Onslaught games, so scaling quite well per battle size, and I feel like given what Space Wolves want to do anyway, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you'll get those kills. Again, probably not likely to be super early in the game though, not unless the opponent gives you some really easy ones straight away. If things are going well for you, feels like you might have a pretty reasonable chance of unlocking that by battle round 3, and hopefully unlocking that big +1 to wound. For the power of the detachment rule though, I do feel like the setup is a little bit onerous. Usually in 40k you normally want to be engaging 1 enemy unit with 1 enemy unit typically, and having to throw another unit into the fray just to get a +1 to hit buff doesn't really seem like it's going to be all that worth it versus just maintaining positions and doing what they want to do normally. So I guess maybe it has some incentive for lots of small wolves like Fenrisian Wolf units or Hunting Wolf units, which could be used to trigger the buff for some relatively low points I suppose. I'm just a bit dubious as to how much value you'd get out of it early in the game. After you've unlocked the +1 to wound buff, it becomes way more important and interesting, though still does take a bit of thought to set it up. Units working in tandem, not losing units that are supporting each other, and also making sure that everything can make its charges okay and isn't blocking each other or having 1 unit randomly fail unluckily. Just feels like this one's a bit more hard work to use versus the previous 2 sagas, even if the boosted damage output is very good. For the stratagems of the detachment, there's a few interesting ones. There's 1 command point for Envelop and Ensnare. 1 Space Wolves unit that isn't a monster or vehicle unit can pile in and consolidate 6 inches this phase. And if it does so, then it doesn't need to go towards the closest model, provided it moves towards the closest enemy unit. That one's quite a nice quality of life melee support stratagem, means that you might be able to get more models out of a big squad engaged and fighting. Could be nice if your unit's a little bit strung out, or if you've got a big horde style unit like Bloodclaws or maybe Grey Hunters, and potentially could be quite big after you've destroyed a unit as well, consolidating 6 inches to get to an objective or tag the next enemy. Perhaps the even more interesting thing about it though is the monster keyword that it has, as Space Wolves don't have any monsters yet, so it will be a very weird thing to exclude, like maybe Tyranids excluding vehicle models. It does seem kind of likely it was probably written with Lehman Russ in mind, in a kind of similar way to how we got some rules teasers for Lionel Johnson having the monster keyword in boarding actions in 9th edition. Maybe a tasty hint that the Primarch could be turning up towards the end of the edition. For 1 command point, there's Territorial Advantage. This is for any Space Marine unit, and they get the Sticky Objective rule. This one's triggered after they've charged and killed an enemy, and then a unit happens to be within range of an objective marker. I guess the idea is that, say you have some Wolfguard Terminators or something, they charge an enemy on the midfield and kill it, and that puts them in control of the objective, and at that point you can use the stratagem. I feel like maybe the timing and the setup of it is a bit less helpful than just controlling it in your command phase. I suppose it does have its positives though. You could have a fighting melee unit charge and destroy something on the midfield, trigger this rule, and then if the opponent just chooses to shoot them down, you still have that objective I guess. Seems like a reasonable enough support one for helping out the primary if the opponent can't push towards you too fast. For 1 command point, there's Overwhelming Onslaught. This one's a -1 to hit for an enemy unit in the fight phase if they're in engagement range with 2 of your Space Marine units or 1 unit of beasts. I guess not too bad to have a reactive melee durability stratagem. The setup does feel a bit on the restrictive side though, and it only applies to 1 enemy squad. Maybe occasionally it might make a big difference though if, say, the enemy combat interrupts in between one of your units and the second one fighting if it's a big threat. Could be usable, but even so, 1 command point for a -1 to hit isn't going to be mad standout. For 1 command point, there's Chosen Prey. This one's a fallback shoot and charge for a Space Wolves unit. Definitely not a bad skirmish support one, maybe a little bit less directly helpful than things like Advance and Charge, but it could be a good one to allow you to drop back, shoot something, and then charge either the same unit to get fights first again, or something completely different. Certainly handy to have in a melee army roster though. For 1 command point, there's Bounding Advance. This one's a Space Wolf infantry or beast unit, and they can move through enemy models this phase aside from Titanic ones, and you can use this in the movement or the charge phase. I guess this one's mainly aimed at defeating enemy screening units. If people are trying to move block you, you might well be able to hop to the other side of them with some Wulfen, and then charge the thing that they were trying to protect. Definitely one to bear in mind, though maybe feels a little bit on the situational side. And finally there's 1 command point for Marked for Destruction. 2 non-beast Space Marine shooting units both can only shoot 1 visible unit this turn, but when they do so, they may reroll wound rolls of 1. I guess if you're trying to focus fire and destroy something, that could be fairly helpful, maybe when combined with Oath of Moment. Reroll wound rolls of 1 isn't a spectacular damage buff as it goes though. I feel like this one just limps into being kind of okay. If you're getting maximal value for 2 shooting units that already wanted to be firing at the same thing, I'd guess that this one will be a bit on the niche side though. Overall, there's definitely some interesting stuff here. Feels like this one is going for the more sort of technical melee play kind of army compared with some of the rest. The 6-inch pylon and consolidations is nice enough, sticky objectives are a nice trick for scoring, and defeating screens and falling back shooting and charging will give you a whole load of interesting options for when you're engaging the enemy, just maybe not quite the sheer obvious power that things like advance and charge or big damage stratagems could add. Finally, for the enhancements for this one, we've got Wolfmaster for 5 points printed. A Space Wolves model selects a friendly unit within 9 inches, and then their Teeth and Claw attacks or Tynak and Fenrir attacks get lethal hits. It doesn't really hurt, but it's not really going to be a huge boost, as the Wolf attacks aren't usually a major part of their unit's damage. At 5 points though, this feels more like a points filler one that you could throw on something, maybe more meaningful if you can be in range of Thunderwolves. I guess not super easy to coordinate with them though, given that they don't have leaders now. Feral Rage is 15 points printed. This one's +1 attack to the bearer's melee weapons, going to a +2 attacks on the charge. Quite a nice and simple small melee damage buff there. I think for 15 points that seems reasonable enough, or maybe something like a Wolfguard Battle Leader, or perhaps another Space Marine unit like a Judaseer or Captain. Swift Hunters is printed at 20 points, and this one gives you a scout move 7 inches for the bearer's unit, which is all rather nice. This one's Space Wolves only, so it could be good for something like the Wolfguard Headtakers. They'd be able to close on their foe really quite quickly there. They definitely could be handy for Grey Hunters or Bloodclaws taking up residence on a mid-board objective right from the word go. Then finally we've got Fenrisian Grit, which is 15 points printed for a 4+ feel no pain. This one's any Space Marine model, so could apply to other things. Quite a nice durability buff there. It could make for a super tanky Gravis Captain if you wanted to run him solo due to his damage debuff. People sometimes enjoy doing that in Gladius. Again, seems like a pretty reasonable points filler and does genuinely make something like a Wolfguard Battle Leader a lot more annoying to take down. You'd normally have to take down 10 wounds off his profile as opposed to 5. This definitely could have some interest for characters wanting to run solo if you wanted. Overall, definitely still feels like there's interesting stuff in this one. I must admit I'm not the biggest fan of the detachment rule, as I think it's just going to be a bit clunky and hard to make use as much as you'd like it to. The Stratagems definitely offers some pretty powerful, interesting melee support though, and looks like it's skewed a bit more towards, say, technical tournament play, more so than just raw speed, damage and defense. I feel like it's going to be a lot better in the hands of someone who knows 40k inside out, as opposed to someone new just getting obvious advantages from big damage. The enhancements are also usable enough. I feel like maybe the Scout 7 inches one might be the standout though, to get melee units into a threatening position and cause the opponent problems fast. Overall, feels like all the detachments have some interest. If I had to guess from first impressions, I might guess that the Beastslayer one might be the most popular. It just seems like a very easy damage buff that's absolutely great against certain armies, and feels like a solid boost to all those Strength 5 and Damage 2 profiles the Space Wolves have, and then some really nice stratagems to support between reactive moves, return to reserves, nice easy damage, and a couple of cool unit-specific ones. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts though. Would that be your go-to detachment, or do you prefer one or the other straight off? Let's get on to the second half of the Codex though, with the unit datasheets. This is the unit list of the models in the Codex. There's 20 in total, a whole bunch of squads, vehicles and characters. For the units we have Grey Hunters and Bloodclaws for the battle line, then 2 flavours of Wolfguard with their new miniatures, Wolfguard Headtakers and Wolfguard Terminators. The Thunderwolf Cavalry remain, though as mentioned their leaders are gone. They still have Fenrisian Wolves, and interestingly enough, a way to get sort of more units of them if you want, with smaller squad size counts, by splitting them off from the Wolfguard Headtakers. And then we now have 2 different flavours of Wulfen, one a regular one with the claws and power weapons and things, and one with the storm shields and hammers. For the vehicle units, the 4 box Dreadnoughts remain, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, Murderfang the Wulfen Dreadnought, and the Space Wolves Venerable Dreadnought. And then for special characters, there's Logan Grimnar, Jarl Stormcaller, Ragnar Blackmane and Arjak Rockfist, and then Ulrich the Slayer being the only named character surviving out of the Firstborn lineup. And finally for generic characters, we've got the Wolfguard Battle Leader, Wolf Priest, and the Firstborn Iron Priest Tech Marine style guy. As expected, that does mean that they've had some pretty big datasheet cuts. It's happened to a fair few of the Divergent chapters over the course of 10th edition, as well as just armies in general of course. The biggest and most painful one in my opinion was the loss of the Stormwolf and Stormfang gunship. The Space Wolves unique flyer looks like it's being sent to Legends and the model being taken off sale. That'll really suck for people who've bought one of those, given it's a big expensive kit and will take a lot of hobby efforts to get looking good, and not exactly great feels to lose a flavourful model, even if Games Workshop have basically decided that flyers aren't supposed to be good in 10th edition. Another really big surprise in my opinion was Hounds of Morkai. As a Space Wolves Primaris unit, they seemed like they'd be almost certain to stay, but it seems not for whatever reason. They were just basically Reavers with a Space Wolf upgrade sprue thrown on them with some different lore and a different paint scheme. They did maybe feel a little bit lazy in unit design when they brought them out, but given that they have made the effort of making them a thing, I really just don't see why they didn't just keep them around. I guess if you want to field them now, they're basically Reavers but with a different paint scheme. The Wolf Scouts, Skyclaws and Longfangs are all just going to be represented by their generic Codex Space Marine versions now. That's not really any big enormous surprise, I think. They don't have updated plastic kits and more or less operate pretty similarly to their more Codex versions. That shouldn't be the single most painful change in the world, though they will lose a little bit of war gear access, and I feel like it could be annoying to know that they'll be locked out of a bunch of Space Wolf keyword synergies in the Codex. Kind of feels like Games Workshop should errata to put the Space Wolves keyword on a bunch of their other themed units. Maybe things like captains to represent wolf lords and all the other things they're known for like Swiftclaw bikers, Skyclaw jump troops. It'd be nice to have them have access to the Codex's detachment synergies. Otherwise, as mentioned, they've lost all the Thunderwolf characters as well. Canis Wolfborn, Harold Deathwolf, the Thunderwolf Lord and the Battle Leader. Again, might have been nice if they'd chosen to just keep at least one of those around to have a leader option for the squad. That's going to drastically impact how good they are in Stormlands. And pretty bad news for people who'd built up some maximal Thunderwolf lists. I had seen a fair few going around with multiple attached Thunderwolf Cavalry characters. For the named characters, Lucas the Trickster and Crom Dragongaze are removed. I think people were generally expecting those. Lucas has a sort of doppelganger model with the Bloodclaw Sergeant model looking somewhat like him, and Logan Grimnar on Storm Rider is no longer a thing. He's just available as a Terminator now. Finally, for the other generic characters, all the pack leaders are gone. The Terminator Battle Leader isn't a thing, and the Cyberwolf leader for the Fenrisian Wolves has also gone away. I guess for the Terminator Battle Leader, you could use him as one of the other Terminator characters, perhaps a captain. Definitely a fairly painful amount of datasheet cuts there. I think people generally knew that it was coming though, given what Games Workshop has been doing with Space Marines in 10th. If anything, it was maybe slightly good news that Thunderwolf Cavalry and their unique Dreadnoughts didn't go away. They were the other two that felt like they might well have been at risk, and particularly so with Blood Angels losing access to their Librarian Dreadnought. That still leaves us 20 datasheets remaining though, and before we get into those, I'll just mention that the printed points aren't final when they're printed in the Codex. I think a lot of people basically get this now, but you still get people not understanding that the printed points in the Codex don't tend to match up too well with the digital points that Games Workshop publishes when a Codex comes out. They're pretty well always incorrect to a greater or lesser degree. Maybe the biggest recent example would be the Astra Militarum Combat Engineers. They are printed at 35 points, and then the digital points swiftly put them up to 70 to stop them being the single best unit for the points in the entire game pretty much. That points download will likely come within the next couple of weeks, and we might hear more from their content creators before then. Either way, when we know the Space Wolf points, I'll most certainly be covering it here on the channel, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see that. In any case though, let's jump into those new datasheets, and we'll start out with the Grey Hunters, one of the new and shiny new model kits from Games Workshop, as we can see here. The Space Wolf veterans that are sort of their tactical marine equivalent, fighting with a bit of true grit with bolters in their pistol grips, with bolt carbines and massed chainswords. I quite like the combination of fairly standard looking Primaris with a bunch of Space Wolf trinkets and things just to set them apart a bit. Rules wise, pre-Codex they were 85 points or 170. Printed in the book, they're listed at 190, though of course that might well change in a big way, and they have had a whole bunch of datasheet changes. First up, you can only take a squad of 10 of them now, which maybe isn't the most useful thing in the world for a sort of objective skirmish unit where you might have ideally wanted to take fewer. It means that you're going for really quite a big commitment, 20 wound Astartes squad. These guys move a little bit faster than regular Space Marines at a 7-inch move, and that's a theme that's common to the rest of the Space Wolf datasheets. Basically everything gained just a tiny bit of movement to help them surge towards melee that bit faster. The other notable thing about their stat block is they get a pretty weighty OC3. It means that these guys are going to be a massive weight on objectives if they can get there. Even enemy troops might struggle to outscore them if you can get a few models in range of an objective and not die. Otherwise, for their damage output, they're going to have an absolute flurry of horde killing attacks. Their bolt carbines get 2 shots out to 24 inches with strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1, but you also get rapid fire as well, so you've got 3 shots within 12 inches, and then in melee each guy also gets to attack with their Astartes chainsword as well, so 4 attacks in melee at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, everything re-rolling wound rolls of 1, and if their target is in range of an objective, re-roll the wound roll instead. That's quite a nice one to at least help them stack a bunch of saves on tougher enemy targets out there. Though having kind of low AP, they're still going to struggle with anything that's either high toughness of 8 or more and good saves. Besides that, the pack leader gets a power fist and a plasma pistol. The power fist does seem like a good idea to give the squad just a little bit of punching up against tougher things. As mentioned briefly earlier as well, another big change from the Space Wolves Codex is that generic characters can't lead their unique units. Unlike some equivalents for, say, the Dark Angels Codex, there's no rule to say that if a character could lead, say, an Intercessor squad, then they can attach to these guys. So I guess unless they do some sort of big core Codex Space Marines errata style thing, they're going to be locked out of a whole bunch of choices that might have otherwise had access to, like say for example captains who might be taking the role of a Wolf Lord. For the overall unit, it means that you have to have quite a big investment in a unit that doesn't really do too much damage against tough stuff, so I guess those rerolls would help out any characters that are attached for them to help them hit harder. Feels like you probably compare them against things like standard assault intercessors. They seem to be quite a bit cheaper from this and bring similar sort of things to the table, but don't have things like a 7-inch move, OC3, and the big volume fire bolt guns. Overall feels like a bit of an unusual unit. At the right points cost, they'd certainly be interesting, and they definitely could be a force to just swarm a mid-board objective and cover it in OC for a turn. And I guess in the context of Space Wolves, they are going to have a big draw versus the generic units due to being able to use far more detachment synergies. Next up, their counterparts and maybe rivals are the Bloodclaws. These guys are the young, impetuous and hot-blooded Space Wolves looking to make a name for themselves, well famed for throwing themselves into battle with their berserk charges, and again have some rather nice new miniatures from Games Workshop, these ones with a good sense of motion and charging across the battlefield towards you. Pre-Codex, these were in units of 10 to 15, now it looks like you can field them in squads of either 10 or 20. The printed points cost is 135 or 270. And if so, that makes them basically the single cheapest Space Marine equivalents out of any. Digital points could certainly change that though. They've got a fairly similar standard power armoured stat line to the Grey Hunters, only OC2, that's still quite a lot with so many models, and they have that same 7-inch move. Their weapons are really quite straightforward, the same sort of volume chainsaw profile. The squad's armed with standard bolt pistols, so not heavy ones or anything like that, and then the pack leader can and probably should take a power weapon and plasma pistol. That guy with the lightning claw here who's totally not Lucas. Their special rule gives them an advance and charge, so that does mean that they should be able to make charges straight onto the mid-board objectives if the opponent moves up to take them, and could be kind of interesting with Njal Stormcaller as well. That means that you could have a unit move 13 inches and then still charge. They do seem kind of similar to the Grey Hunters for battlefield role, wanting to be a big brawly unit on the mid-board with a bunch of OC, and could have a few interesting synergies. You're basically trading out some much better supporting rules for some sheer amount of bodies and moving a bit faster. And I guess they'll also have rivals for the more standard Space Marine units, things like Assault Intercessors, where you could have 75 points for a small squad of Space Marines with some rerolls, trying to scrap and be expendable on the midfield. Hopefully they manage to get the points cost for the Grey Hunters and Bloodclaws right. I feel like they are going to need to be cheap, just given the fact that they don't do crazy amounts of damage to anything tough. Next up, we've got the Wolfguard Headtakers. These guys sort of feel like Space Wolves equivalent Blade Guard, with their round shields and then power axes. There'll be some in the Space Wolves army set, like the previous two units, and they come paired with a bunch of Fenrisian Wolves. These are supposed to be the younger and more bombastic members of the Wolfguard, seeking to make names for themselves. Pre-Codex, these guys were represented by the more standard Wolfguard datasheet, though basically their datasheet's entirely rewritten now. There's 3 to 6 of them in a unit, and their printed points cost is 90 points or 180 without the Wolves, so the same cost as Blade Guard used to be before they went down, going up to either 110 points or 220 points with the Wolves. In particular, the 110 point value seems like really quite a nice one. That's just 20 points for 3 Wolves as a nuisance screening unit, and that feels like a very good deal as an add-on style unit. Talking about those Wolves first, and basically they break off into their own units during the declare battle formation step, so they can be deployed just completely elsewhere on the board. And they have the same rule as the Fenrisian Wolves, where if they're within 6 inches of a friendly Space Wolves and non-Wulfen character, then they get OC1, so they might be able to do some support work on objectives and things. For the main event though, we have the Wolfguard Headtakers themselves, and they have a fairly similar stat line to Blade Guard veterans. 3 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save if you take them with a shield. And for their base damage they have mastercrafted power weapons, 3 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2, again very similar to Blade Guard. Interestingly though, they have the option of fielding without the shields, so you can take a sword and axe, and with those paired mastercrafted power weapons they basically get 6 attacks, all at that same profile. So at the expense of a fair bit of durability you get a fairly monstrous 18 attacks at that damage profile, just out of a unit of 3 of them, supposedly for 90 points. Both of those at least feel kind of interesting. The Storm Shield certainly, so they're not just a pushover to take down in return, but just the sheer amount of damage they can do with those mass attacks seems very nice. Their special rule allows them to nominate a quarry at the start of the game, and when the Headtaker models make attacks against that quarry, their weapons gain devastating wounds and precision, so a good chance to punch through some invulnerable saves and maybe assassinate characters straight out of units. If their quarry target should happen to be destroyed over the course of the game, they can immediately nominate a new one. Overall, with a fairly chunky damage and defensive profile and being one of the more actual threatening melee units that the power armoured Space Wolves can join, they certainly look like they're going to be a pretty interesting unit. And I feel like those random small squads of hunting wolves look like a pretty nice bonus. In particular, if there's a good reason to take a small squad of 3 Headtakers, then the 20-point ones for 3 of them seem pretty excellent just for nuisance factor. That's not all for the Wolf Guard, of course, as we also have the Wolf Guard Terminators. Again, nicely received models as the Elite Guard for the Space Wolves, the previous kit that they had but reimagined for the newer and bigger chunky Terminator armour. Lots of cool power weapons, loads of theme and talismans and trophies and things, and some pretty fun heads with a wide variety of snazzy facial hair. For their datasheets, pre-Codex they were 185 points per 5 of them. Printed in the book, they're 180, though as usual that might change, and they get a fairly standard Space Marine Terminator stat line, nice and tanky with 3 wounds at toughness 5, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, but also get a boosted movement stat of 6 inches. Their weapon loadout is locked to what you get in the box. Most of the standard Terminators get a similar sort of mastercrafted power weapon sort of special rule, 4 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2, and then you can pair those either with a Storm Bolter for a bit of volume fire, or a Storm Shield to give them a wound characteristic of 4. I'd guess that the Storm Shield might be the way that most people choose to go with that one. Then you get 2 special models in the squad. 1 per 5 of them can take an Assault Cannon and Power Fist, which seems like a pretty reasonable upgrade with a bit of devastating wound shooting and some strength 8 melee to back it up, and then the pack leader can either take Twin Lightning Claws or Relic Great Axe. It feels like that Relic Great Axe is worth the upgrade. That means you only get 3 attacks, but they hit at strength 7, AP 2, damage 3 and devastating wounds. To me that feels like it's worth passing up a Storm Shield for. Finally, their datasheet rule is a -1 to wound if they're attacked by enemies that have a strength greater than their toughness value, and that's going to be a lot of the things that the Terminators actually need to fear. Quite a nice rule to double down on their durability. That's to be instead of Fury of the First compared with the standard Loyalist Terminators, I suppose. For notable things as well, they can't be joined by the more standard Terminator characters, so unfortunately no captains or chaplains giving them damage boosts, but they are the only units that Logan Grimnar or Arjak Rockfist could join. Both of those could help them out a fair bit against bigger, tougher stuff, particularly Arjak Rockfist with his anti-keyword hammer. In general, Terminators haven't really been so standout for Space Wolves so far in 10th edition, though I feel like this unit is definitely good enough that with the right points cost it could definitely be pretty central, though we'll have to see what they eventually wind up with. Next up, and sticking with the Space Wolf fighting elites, we've got the Thunderwolf Cavalry. These guys have kind of been the order of the day for a lot of competitive Space Wolf lists, particularly with the Stormlance Task Force, a bunch of big, fast and tough units moving around the board with characters. Pre-Codex they were 120 points or 240 for 3 to 6 models. The printed points here are either 100 or 200. For their stat line they're fairly similar. 4 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save if you take the Storm Shield, which presumably you would. They move a little bit faster than they used to at 12 inches, which will definitely help them get into their targets. They can have some fancy pistols if they swap out the Storm Shield, so they can have some plasma fire on the go if you'd like, but certainly the main event is in melee. They've got Wolf Guard weapons, which they can strike with for the riders, 4 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2. That previously was AP -1 and damage 1, so a big buff there. And the Thunderwolves themselves attack with crushing teeth and claws. Despite having the damage increased for their Wolf Guard weapons, it looks like they still retain the same datasheet rule, which means they get +1 damage on the charge, though it only applies to the Wolf Guard weapons and not the crushing teeth and claws. That means they'll be going in with a bunch of strength 5 and damage 3 attacks when they make a charge, so very nasty against things like Terminator equivalents. Overall, feels like the core datasheet has just had a flat upgrade really. They move a bit faster and certainly hit a fair bit harder, though they'll now have no characters to lead them, which means no hidden Power Fist or Thunderhammer attacks, no free stratagems or reactive moves or lethal hits. It means they'd have to carry their own weight as a unit a lot more than they used to, and it feels a bit less likely that they're going to absolutely carry the entire army in Stormlance Task Force compared with what they did. Still look usable though, maybe more with things like the Beastslayer damage buffs, getting lethal hits where they need it, and a +1 to wound stratagem. Both of those would work well with these nice general purpose profiles. Next up, we've got the Fenrisian Wolves. Pre-Codex, they were 30 points for 5 or 60 points for 10. Printed in the Codex, they're 40 points and 80 points for those same numbers, though as usual that might change, and that gets you 5 dogs, moving 10 inches with a toughness 4 and a bad armor save. Their teeth and claw attacks having been slightly improved, they now get 3 attacks rather than 2, though still at that same profile of strength 4, AP 0, damage 1 and hitting on a 4+, able to kill a few lighter infantry, but not really much more than that. Their datasheet rules have been changed around a bit. Previously they could advance and charge innately, though that's gone. They do have 2 good things in its place though. First up, they get a reactive move where if an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches, they get to make a normal move of d6 inches, so it could be good to hide behind terrain or be annoying. And otherwise they have Hunting Hounds, which means that if they're within 6 inches of a character keyword unit, they get some OC, and that could mean that they could do things like actions, or potentially help being a trading unit on objectives. Next up, we've got the Savage Wulfen, which had their datasheet split as per war gear. Now there's a datasheet for them with their Wulfen Claws and melee weapons, and then one for their Wulfen Hammers and Storm Shields. Previously, there were 95 points per 5 of them. They're printed at 80 points for this squad, and then 90 points for the Hammer squad. So I guess the idea is that probably the squad with the hammers will cost a bit more. They do seem to have had some important stat line changes. They move a little bit faster at 9 inches. They've got toughness 6, though that has come at the price of their 6+ feel no pain, so not really getting any more durable on that front. And otherwise they're still 2 wounds at toughness 4. They've dropped down to leadership 7 from leadership 6, and as mentioned with that Curse of the Wulfen rule at the start of the video, they might be OC 0, but if they're within 6 inches of a Space Wolves character, or within 12 inches of a Wolf Priest, they go up to OC 1, which will be handy. Their Stormfrag Auto Launcher shooting attack has had a small side grade. They're now a choice where you weigh it up whether or not you want that shooting attack, or to be able to reroll hit rolls of 1 natively in melee with their Death Totem it's called. I guess the Death Totem will help them out more with their primary purpose. The whole bunch of Stormfrag blast shots might be able to mess up a light infantry unit as they charge into a primary target. The Stormfrag shots now hit on a 4+, but they're now D3 shot blast as opposed to D6 shot blasts. Still could stack a fair amount of saves on a light infantry unit though if they had a bunch of these guys firing at them. For their damage output, previously the claws and melee weapons were far inferior to the hammers. Now though they've given them a fair bit more bite. They're 3 attacks each now at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2. Really quite a lot of that profile in this book, and they also get sustained hits 1 at base, and as mentioned might well be re-rolling hit rolls of 1 from their Death Totem. Again, it's a nice enough profile on a fast moving and hard hitting unit. It'd be kind of similar to the amount of damage that gets put out by the unit of Headtakers without the Storm Shields. If anything, probably a little bit better than them. Finally, their datasheet rule was shifted around. Previously, they had a chance to fight in death, which has been given to Murderfang. Now they trigger Desperate Escape for units within engagement range. Everything besides monsters and vehicles must test it if they want to fall back, subtracting 1 from the test if they're battle shocked as well. It's not an awful datasheet rule. Could be nice to kill 1 unit and tag the next to force some decisions. If the opponent can just countercharge though, they could just leave the squad in melee, and usually losing a third of a minor unit isn't the biggest thing in the world. Still not a bad rule to cause some more annoying choices though. Overall, if they do wind up being at this points cost, I feel like they've got a good amount of improvements. Really nice to be able to access some OC, and broadly the datasheet changes seem fine. Looks like they could be a very interesting unit for certain stratagems and detachment buffs. Otherwise, there's the option for the same squad but with Storm Shields. Their stat line and most things are pretty well similar to the previous. They still have the option of the Storm Frags versus the Death Totems. The difference is that as they have Storm Shields, they get a 4+ invulnerable save, so will be really quite significantly tankier versus the previous. And then their Wulfen Hammer gives you a 2 attacks with strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3, but with anti-monster and anti-vehicle 3+. So kind of the equivalent of making attacks with say like strength 14 or something against the vast majority of those kind of targets. Certainly seems interesting. There'll be a bit more of a dedicated anti-tank style unit, not really having all that many attacks to be able to take down infantry. Being a fair bit tougher is helpful enough though. Their datasheet rule is a debuff 1 for tanks and monsters that they've hit. After you've hit 1 with a hammer, then you choose 1 to be suppressed until the end of the next turn. And while they're suppressed, they're -1 to hit, which could be kind of disruptive for certain things. Again, they also seem interesting enough to me. Really quite a different damage profile, but still an interesting one. They move fast, will hit tough stuff hard, and the chance to gain some OC is a fairly big deal. Next up, we have the Dreadnought datasheets, and the Space Wolves get 4 of them from their multi-build Venerable Dreadnought kit. Let's talk about the 2 non-character versions, then move forward to the character ones. The regular Venerable Dreadnought has a similar stat line to plenty of regular Dreadnoughts. Toughness 9 with 8 wounds and a 2+ save. These can take a Blizzard Shield if they want to for a 4+ invulnerable save in expense of 1 weapon. And the Venerable Dreadnought got a boosted movement characteristic going up to 8 inches. Previously they only moved 6 inches, so were incredibly easy to keep out of the fight. That'll be a bit harder to do now though, and it will be able to take advantage of its own buffing rule called the Fervor of the Ancients. It's replaced its reroll 1s to hit and wound for nearby infantry for a +1 to advance and charge for Space Wolves units within 6 inches, and I guess that would also affect himself. Otherwise, for datasheet changes, the Hellfrost cannon that he has had a slight tweak. If you fire it on its big profile now, it's a single shot at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 5. Really quite all or nothing, but that's going to be far more effective against things like toughness 9 and toughness 10. I guess it might be between the Hellfrost and Multi-Melter as the main debate now. Looks like it can't take the Plasma Cannon, nor the Las Cannon, nor the Missile Launcher. All of those having gone away as options. Maybe in reality though it might be more tempting to take a melee weapon with a Blizzard Shield if you're running this guy. That's to be a 4+ save and maybe a Fenrisian Great Axe. which has got a boosted number of attacks. You can have 6 attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage D6 plus 1, which is a fairly good profile, and the option of sweeps as well. Definitely an interesting enough damage profile, though if he remains at that printed Codex cost of 140 points, still seems a bit on the pricey side for what you get for overall damage and defense. Hopefully he'll come down a bit from that, as a bunch of the Chaos Space Marine Hellbrutes seem to have been getting. Next up we have the devolved Wulfen version of that same Dreadnought, and he gets a inbuilt 9-inch move as opposed to the 8-inch, and still has a 6+ feel no pain to make him that bit tankier. He's just got access to the melee weapons and Blizzard Shield, and has the choice as to whether or not he wants that 4+ invulnerable save for his defense, or to go with 2 melee weapons, which are given the choice of the different profiles, and both of them also gain twin links as well from Violent Fury. The damage output of his weapons are fairly similar. He gets a Great Wolf Claw, which gives him an AP 3 and damage 3 attack if he wants to use that. And his special rule is a surge move kind of similar to the Blood Angel's Death Company Dreadnought now. When this guy gets shot and loses at least 1 wound, he can make a Bestial Rage move of D6 plus 2 inches, finishing as close as possible towards the nearest enemy non-aircraft unit, and that can be used to jump into engagement range and presumably get ripping things up in the later turn. Could be an annoying skirmisher for the mid-board objectives, and having a bit more movement certainly helps him out as well. Again, I guess that the biggest worry with these is potentially not having the durability to stand up to enemy shooting before making melee. 8 wounds at toughness 9 just isn't really all that much, even if you do have good saves. Next up we've got the character keyword Dreadnoughts, and first up there's Bjorn the Fell-Handed. He was 190 points before, the printed points cost is 180, though as usual that might change. For his rules alterations, he had a fair few things that are somewhat similar to the previous. He moves 9 inches rather than 8 now, and he's a bit tankier than the other dreads with a 5+ feel no pain. His durability rule has been shifted around. Previously it was a big half damage one. Now it's a -1 to wound if the enemy's strength is greater than his toughness, which will still be good against big dedicated anti-tank weapons, though I don't think it's quite on the same level as half damage. He has gained a 5+ invulnerable save though as well, so I guess that could help out against the really highest AP weapons out there. For his ranged weapons, it looks like he's lost the option to take a las cannon or plasma cannon. That's maybe a bit of a shame given that the las cannon was maybe one of the favoured choices. I guess it's probably Hellfrost or Multi-Melter now, the Hellfrost having that boosted characteristic at strength 10 and damage 5. In melee he hits nice and hard with True Claw, that's strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 with 6 attacks hitting on a 2, and he gets lethal hits as well, if he does happen to have any difficulty with the wound roll. Finally, his other datasheet ability is really quite a nice one. Previously he had the increase a command point cost one for nearby enemy units, now he just generates you a command point in your command phase. Really quite a big and easy straightforward rule to get lots of value from in the first few battle rounds. Ideally you'd hopefully not have him killed too early. Overall still looks like a pretty solid datasheet. I say with the durability changes probably not quite as hard to take down, though that command point generation is rather good. Certainly could be interesting enough for the character detachment with an unusually big fighty and chunky single character model. Finally for the Dreadnoughts we've got Murderfang, the character Wulfen Dreadnought. He's printed at his index cost of 170 points, though I would say it's probably been downgraded overall. He's got similar stats to the Wulfen Dreadnought for the most part, still getting that 6+ feel no pain and the boosted 9-inch movement, and he attacks with the Murder Claws. 8 attacks at strength 14, AP -2, damage 3, twin linked, and also picking up sustained hits now as well. That's not really going to be a profile that virtually anyone wants to get hit by, though maybe particularly not big tough stuff. For his special rules, he can't be Warlord. He's gained rerolling advance and charge rolls, so is a little bit more reliable to make him to melee, though his main special rule has been swapped to a 4+ fight on death one that can be an aura to nearby Wulfen units. Feels like that might just be a little bit on the clunky side to coordinate with them, though definitely could be potentially powerful against a melee opponent. It does mean though that he's lost his multiple activation style one, which maybe feels a little bit painful after the World Eater's Hellbrute retained that in quite such a convincing way. At first impressions, he just really doesn't look like he's worth 170 points anymore, when maybe he might have been a bit more tempting previously. I'd hope that he'd come down in points considerably in the digital download. Moving on to the cast of Space Wolves heroes and characters though, and next up we have Logan Grimnar himself, the Chapter Master and High King of the Space Wolves, who had a particularly impressive and well-received miniature, standing atop a rocky outcrop, flanked by 2 wolves, Tynak and Fenrir, modelled in the new and upscaled Terminator armour. In general, his miniature's gone down rather well. In-game pre-Codex he was 115 points to field and had the option to either go on Storm Rider, which cost a bit more, or on foot in Terminator armour, and either way his big rule was to give you a big turn of reroll charge rolls and reroll hit rolls in melee, which was a pretty big deal effect for a single miniature to bring army wide. For his new rules he has lost the option to be fielded on Storm Rider anymore. He moves 6 inches and has 8 wounds rather than 6, I guess that's to represent his wolves being there and taking bullets perhaps. He still seems to have deep strike though, so they don't seem to have had too much trouble in encouraging the wolves into the teleportarium. For his melee damage, it's pretty big hitting, though the same as it was previously. 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 with the Axe Morkai, with the option for a sweep attack for a bunch of strength 6 and AP 2 damage 1 ones. Tynak and Fenrir can help out against horde style targets though. They give him 6 extra attacks at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1, all hitting on a 2+, and it means he's going to be unusually good at taking down horde style units now. His special rules have been changed completely though. He's now got Bjorn's old one of increasing stratagem cost when units are within 12 inches of this model. If the enemy wants to target one of their units with a stratagem there, it's going to cost them 1 extra command point. That's really quite an irritating rule to have fighting over the midboard. Quite a nice debuff there. And then he has the option to arrive a unit on round 1 from strategic reserve. The rule is to treat the battle round as 1 higher. So that means that you could have something turn up from the board edges round 1. If they've got the deep strike keyword, they can still use that to deep strike turn 1, and he could use this to affect himself as well. And then battle round 2, it means that a strategic reserve unit could use that to flank around and appear in the opponent's deployment zone, even if you can usually only do that turn 3. It only applies to Space Wolf units as well, so you can't do things like turn 1 deep strike and scepters and things, and you can't use this for rapid ingress as it's only in your movement phase. Definitely seems interesting. You could have a very fighty Wolfguard Terminator squad in the midfield right from turn 1. Though there's not really a good way to guarantee melee from that, given he'd be dropping at 9 inches and then maybe command point re-rolling for about a coin flip chance to get in. For leader choices, he can only go with the Wolfguard Terminators, and it takes up the space of 4 models when in a transport, so I feel like that might be a bit less tempting if he's got a fancy reserve rule that he wouldn't be able to use if he's in a Land Raider. Overall, it's definitely interesting rules, though I would hope that he's still going to keep at least this equally cheap. It maybe doesn't feel quite as big a deal to the army as the big army-wide rerolls used to be, but both the rules are potentially powerful in their own way. Next up, we've got Ragnar Blackmen. He is 90 points for a 5-wound Wolf Lord with a 4+ invulnerable save. He got the boosted movement of 7 inches like the rest. His damage output is still fairly similar with Frostfang, a big bunch of 8 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 with sustained hits, so seriously nice at taking down things like standard issue Space Marines there, though he isn't quite as savage on the charge with it now, only adding +2 to his attacks characteristic for 10 attacks, and no longer +2 to strength, so it'll be strength 6 and not strength 8 on the charge. Weirdly enough, he doesn't have the option of running with Grey Hunters. You've got the option of either Blood Claws or the Wolfguard Headtakers with him. If he's leading Blood Claws, then models in the unit can reroll wound rolls, which is a seriously nice boost for him, and very good for his own attacks as well at strength 6. If he's leading the Wolfguard Headtakers, they can advance and charge, so quite a long threat range there. It does mean with the character units being locked out, he can no longer lead things like Blade Guard or Assault Intercessors, so he's got to go alongside one of his Space Wolf units. On paper certainly seems interesting enough for both squads. Wolfguard Headtakers will certainly like the advance and charge all the time, and his own attacks will chip into damage very nicely there. And for the Blood Claws, I feel like he does enough just by himself to turn them from a sort of low threat, fighty chaff unit to a fairly dangerous one. Just literally with his own 10 attacks on the charge and rerolling wound rolls with everything, that's going to really change the character of the unit. Next up, we've got Ulrich the Slayer, one of 2 surviving firstborn character models. He was 70 points previously for the High Wolf Priest, and the Codex printed cost is 70 points. He's got a sort of Space Marine Chaplain style stat line, 4 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save, a 5+ leadership, and again he moves 7 inches. He strikes with a plasma pistol, and then his Artificer Crozius gives you a bunch of attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. It looks like that's picked up some anti-keywords there, so he has anti-monster and anti-vehicle 4+. That does mean that's just a very general purpose profile, good for taking down tough stuff and good for taking down infantry. Previously he gave you some rather nice inbuilt rerolls. It's been shifted around a bit to something called Slayer's Oath now. He'll always give his unit +1 to hit, so you could have Wolfguard Headtakers or something hitting on a 2+, and then you get +1 to wound against his Slayer's Oath target, picking either the keyword character, monster or vehicle at the start of the battle, and then you get the +1 to wound against them. That'll mean it's be a bit better against certain skewed enemy lists. If you're playing Imperial Knights or say Tyranid Nidzilla style lists, then he's going to have a good time. Furthermore, if you're playing one of the Saga detachments and his unit manages to kill one of the units that he's had his Slayer Oath against, then his unit counts as getting the boosted version of the Saga active for the rest of the game, so I guess potentially things like lethal hits against everything, or those big rerolls from the Saga of the Bold, which is a nice little fun aside. Overall feels like he'd make the Wolfguard Headtakers a pretty general purpose threat, his own damage keywords, plus the +1 to wound thing that he gets against certain things. That's quite a nice combo for taking down tough stuff. Next up we have the great Terminator champion that is Arjak Rockfist, a valued member of Logan Grimnar's Wolfguard, with a rather fun new miniature and the option to assemble him with his hammer being thrown. His lore is that he can throw his relic Thunderhammer at you, and then it will teleport back to his grip, kind of all very Thor and Mjolnir style. Pre-Codex he was 95 points and is printed at 95 points in the book as well. He gains the 6 inches movement that the rest of the Terminator equivalents do, and he's the only other character besides Logan Grimnar that can lead Wolfguard Terminators. He gets a big 6 wounds with that Storm Shield, so a fairly tanky defensive profile, and hits with a bunch of very general purpose hammer attacks. Though Hammer gets 5 attacks that hits on a 2+, Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 3, but Anti-Monster and Anti-Vehicle 3+, so wounding those very easily, and also gets the Precision keyword to hit some characters. If he's fighting against characters as well, he also gets his Champions of the Kingsguard special rule, where if he's targeting a character keyword unit, he can re-roll the hit and wound roll, so a pretty reasonable chance to lay low enemy champions and heroes there. He can also throw his hammer at 6-inch range for a similar sort of attack profile, which is quite fun, and otherwise his other special rule has been traded round a bit. He'd previously give your unit a damage buff if they took casualties, now he gives you fight on death on a 4+, maybe not always super relevant if you're being shot down, but if the enemy is trying to wipe you out in melee, that could be really quite a big deal rule, and make things very painful for them as they do so. Overall feel like Logan's adding some other special rules to the Terminator Wolfguard unit, where he's just maybe just trying to make them a more well-rounded and dangerous threat. Those anti-keywords definitely make him far more threatening against the tough stuff that they might otherwise struggle to deal with. Next up we've got Njal Stormcaller, who's had a reinterpretation of his miniature, dropping down from Terminator armor to power armor once again, and quite a fun new miniature with his Cyber Raven taking flight, and a bunch of rocks levitating off the ground as he casts some great incantation to call down some living lightning, no doubt. Pre-Codex, his points cost was 85 points, the printed cost in the Codex is 85 as well, though obviously that might change, and he has got a very different stat line due to being a power armoured character as opposed to a Terminator armoured one, a 4 wound stat line with a 4+ invulnerable save, overall pretty similar to Ulrich the Slayer. For his damage output he gets both sustained hits 2 on his ranged and melee attacks. Living Lightning is his Witchfire attack with a bunch of Strength 7, AP 1 and Damage 1 shots, all very good for clearing out hordes. And then in melee his hits are Strength 7, AP 1 and Damage D3+3. For his main special rule he allows units to advance 6 inches automatically while he's leading them, and given that there's a stratagem to allow advance and charge in one detachment, and Blood Claws can just do it innately, you could have a 13-inch movement with some Space Wolves and then go on to charge something, which could get them a really long way across the board. He also gives weapons in his squad the Assault keyword as well, which could be handy enough for Grey Hunters I suppose, getting a big volley of rapid fire shots off. His other debuff is a bit of an unusual one. The unit that's hit by his Living Lightning is minus 6 inches to the range of their ranged weapons, down to a minimum of 12. I guess occasionally that could be disruptive for something like some enemy multi-melters or something, force them to move up a bit or choose different targets. Might be the sort of thing that's just kind of annoying in passing as opposed to game-changing and playing around it. Maybe doesn't feel quite as directly helpful as Stealth on his datasheet was before, even if it's kind of fun. Overall, that auto 6-inch advance is definitely an interesting rule. You could get a lot of OC zoomed up to the mid-board objectives, or make some very long charges with Wolfguard Headtakers maybe. I feel like it's maybe just a bit unfortunate that his damage profile is really quite focused on enemy lighter infantry and things. They're the sort of things that targets like the Blood Claws and the Grey Hunters should probably have covered already with their profiles, and you might look at other units that can help them out against tougher stuff a bit more. Finally, we've got the 3 generic characters for the Space Wolves Codex, these ones being particularly interesting given that lots of the enhancements are only takeable by generic Space Wolves characters. So in practice that means either the Wolf Priest, Battle Leader, or the Iron Priest. The Wolf Priest is another one of the more fun miniatures that Games Workshop came out with. A lot of good reactions to this guy. They're basically the Space Wolves Chaplain and Shaman style equivalents. 3 head swap options here with a Absolver Bolt Pistol versus a Frost Knife type thing. And some cool different head swap options too. Datasheet wise, he's really quite similar to the Space Marine Chaplain datasheet, just a few notable differences. And again, he's got the option to lead Blood Claws, Grey Hunters, or Wolfguard Headtakers only. Chaplains are 60 points currently, his printed points cost are 70, though that doesn't really feel like the worst thing in the world given that his second supporting datasheet rule is quite a good one. For statline things, he's another support character with 4 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save. Unlike Chaplains, he only has a leadership 6+, though being a Space Wolf, he moves a bit faster. His melee damage is pretty similar. An Absolver Bolt Pistol for a big damage 2 shot, and then a Crozius Arcanum with a bunch of strength 6 and damage 2 attacks contributed in melee, though only AP -1. Like the Chaplain, he gets the Litany of Hate, so +1 to the wound roll, which is nice for basically any of the Space Wolf units. They need help punching up against the toughest targets. Though his special rule is a good one as well. Healing Balms basically means that he gets to do apothecary duties as well, and resurrects one slain bodyguard model in the command phase if you've taken casualties. Between the two of those, it feels like the Wolfguard Headtakers might be the best fit for him. +1 to wound is really meaningful on those kind of low strength at strength 5 but AP 2 and damage 2 attacks. Makes them way more general purpose against tougher things, and they're big 30-point models I suppose, so you get a lot more value for restoring them to the board as opposed to cheaper Bloodclaws or Grey Hunters. I guess maybe you might have a little bit more chance to resurrect models on a big 10-man or 20-man Space Marine squad, so it's not likely to be wasted on the others either. But if you're wanting to go for a big melee damage combo, it seems the Headtakers will be the ones to choose. Overall looks pretty interesting if he does remain that 70 points. Otherwise, the other new generic character is the Wolfguard Battle Leader. This one's quite a nice general purpose Space Wolf commander, and looks like he's going to be appearing both in the army set and in the combat patrol box. He's quite a fun and flexible themed miniature with a Storm Shield versus Plasma Pistol in the one hand, a choice of head swaps, and then Thunderhammer versus Power Weapon for his main melee combat. Statline wise, I was guessing that he'd have a similar sort of profile to a Lieutenant, though for whatever reason Games Workshop basically seemed to have given him Captain style stats. He gets a 4+ invulnerable save regardless of whether or not he has his Storm Shield along, gets a big 5 wounds rather than 4 and going up to 6 if he happens to take the Storm Shield, and then the similar number of attacks as a Captain gets in melee. For the Storm Shield hand, you've got the choice of that extra wound, or as an alternative a Plasma Pistol or Mastercrafted Heavy Bolt Pistol or Bolt Carbine, both of which get damage too. The main event certainly his melee though. You either get 7 attacks with that Mastercrafted Power Weapon at Strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, or goes in with a Thunderhammer with 5 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, hitting on a 3+ that one with devastating wounds. I think I'd probably be more tempted by the Thunderhammer, but getting 2 extra attacks isn't nothing either. His damage buff I think is quite a nice one. He gets sustained hits 1 on weapons for his lead unit, nice on those Wolfguard Headtakers, and he also gets 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 against targets within 6 inches, whether shooting or fighting, most normally fighting I suppose. His secondary rule maybe isn't quite so standout, but doesn't hurt. He gets to do a heroic last stand if slain in melee before he's got to fight, so on a 2+ gets to fight on death and hopefully take a chunk out of the enemy unit that killed him. For his printed points cost, he's just 65 points, which seems really quite cheap and effective for that kind of fighty character with a good melee buff. Seems like he'd be a pretty solid melee commander threat to a bunch of units with that, and could definitely be one to use any melee damage enhancements that you might have going in a detachment. Finally, for the last generic character, we've got the Iron Priest, who maybe has a surprisingly dangerous buffing rule here, and seems to add a pretty crazy amount of value to a vehicle unit compared with the standard Tech Marine. He is basically the Space Wolf style Tech Marine and does similar things. He gets lone operative near vehicle units, has a 2+ save, and now for his weapons he has the Hellfrost pistol for a single big shot, or now D6 shots at strength 4 and AP -1 for the Torrent Flamer style profile, and 1 consolidated profile for his Tempest Hammer and Servo Arm, all hitting at strength 8 and damage 3. The big crazy thing that he can do though is the Gift of the Iron Wolf, and this is kind of similar to the Blessing of the Omnisire, where you get heal D3 wounds and +1 to hit, but rather than giving them +1 to hit, he gives the vehicle that he's blessing rapid fire 1 on its weapons. Usually +1 to hit is something like a +25% damage buff for any single shot weapon that he affects with that boost. That could effectively be double damage or a +100% boost, and maybe one of the single most obvious and easy things to use that on could be just something like a Space Marine Predator Annihilator. That's got 3 las cannons and a hunter killer missile, and it basically means that if you're within 24 inches you'd be firing with full force of 2 predators due to the rapid fire. That's pretty mad for a 60-point character that adds his own additional value, and he could certainly use it on plenty of other targets as well. The Ballistus Dreadnought will get on really well, getting 3 attacks with its missiles and las cannons rather than 2 at 24 inches. Or maybe the Repulsor Executioner or the Gladiator Lancer with their big laser destroyer weapons. Getting 1 extra shot on either of those is incredibly intimidating. He still heals the wounds on the vehicle as well, so adds value that way as well, and has a damage buff against anything that's in engagement range of a vehicle as his secondary special rule, which occasionally might crop up but not really something to focus on I think. I feel like the existence of this guy alone does make it at least kind of tempting to take some big punchy Space Wolf firepower along, even just a pair of Predator Annihilators. So you've got redundancy if one gets popped, and then if you want to just hit the enemy with an absolute ton of anti-tank damage, use his buff on one of them, maybe declare Oath of Moment for reroll hit rolls, and you're going to stack a very crazy amount of damage on the foe. That's just about it for rounding up the detachments and datasheets though. Overall looks like it's an interesting codex. There's definitely enough stuff that's got some cool datasheet rules and fun unit profiles, plenty of things that feel like upgrades compared with the codex, though of course army strength is going to depend on those digital points when they get them. I must admit I've got some mixed feelings about separating out the Space Wolf units from the rest of the Space Marine ones. It really isn't the worst thing in the world to focus on their unique units and give good reasons to have them at the forefront of the army. Though maybe there feels like there's a bunch of units that could maybe pick up the Space Wolves tag or something for the fluffy things they might be able to field. Things like Longfang Devastators, Wolf Lord Captains and stuff like that. And it does maybe feel a bit weird and arbitrary that you could have some Grey Hunters standing next to, say, some Incurses or something, and because some of the guys have been put on Phobos duty, they lose access to some really important stratagems and buffing rules. For the detachments, they all look playable, at least casually. I guess we'll see which ones turn up to be the winning ones in competitive play. I wouldn't be too surprised if Beastslayer wins out due to those good stratagems and a good damage rule. I guess we'll wait and see on that front though, and whether or not there might be some draw to things like the Gladius and Stormlance still, who I guess will be competing against them. For the data sheets, it's going to be very points dependent. I feel like Wulfen haven't done too badly out of this one. Being able to gain some OC will be a nice win for them. The troops seem alright with some character combos and things, though I do feel like you've got to commit some big chunky points to scrapping over those mid-board objectives given the unit sizes. Hopefully the Wolfguard Headtakers will be good and efficient enough to be a central unit, as it really feels like a lot of stuff is pushing you towards those. And for characters, really quite a lot of stuff seems usable. At first impressions, I'd probably be more tempted by Arjak over Logan to lead Wolfguard Terminators. Jarl could be interesting to get some big objective control into the mid-board straight away. Though I feel like perhaps the generic characters are some of the standout winners here. The Wolf Priest feels like very good value for his 70 points if that's what he winds up as. The Battle Leader's got a good damage buff and is nice and fighty, and as mentioned, the Iron Priest seems like a real winner as well. Just kind of unexpectedly great damage buffs on things that have got long range weapons. If you want some scary Space Wolf firepower, that's probably the way to go. Let me know your first impressions of the Codex though. What things do you like and what do you dislike? Would you be tempted to put some Space Wolves on the tabletop? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, a big thank you to Ikarus Pattern and Godforge for sponsoring the video. You can find their links in the video description. If you want to pick up some fancy tracks for hover tanks, then be sure to use the code Auspex Wolves for the 10% discount if you're seeing this within the first month. Check out the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked in the video description if you're looking to pick up that Space Wolf box at the weekend. Here are the times for when it goes live. A big thank you to anyone supporting the channel through purchases through them. It does help to keep all the videos coming. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening to this one. I'll certainly be back with more 40k videos with new ones out all the time. I'm sure there's room for a fair few more Space Wolves over the coming few days. I'll certainly be looking forward to talking a few more tactics and unit reviews for the Sons of Russ. If you'd like to support, check out those affiliate links, and the channel does have a Patreon page as well if you'd like to support more directly. A big thank you to anyone helping out there, but just in general a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.